All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. My name is Ryan. I'm the Senior Director of Product and Customer Marketing at KeyFactor. And I'm also joined by our Chief Security Officer, Chris Hickman. Chris, it's great to have you here. How's it going?
Hey, it's going great, Ryan. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So today, Chris and I are excited to walk you through the CISO guide to cryptographic risks and vulnerabilities. This topic is, it couldn't really be more timely because, from my perspective, cryptographic risk is quietly becoming one of the biggest challenges facing CISOs and security teams out there, whether it's on your radar or not. If you're attending this webinar, it's probably at least on your radar, though. And we'll delve into exactly, what that means and why it matters over the next 45 minutes or so. But just a couple of housekeeping items before we get into it. One, we want to keep this interactive, right? So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to weave those into the conversation as we go along versus just cramming them all in the end. We've also got a couple quick polls that'll come up, so keep an eye out for those. And then don't forget to check out the resources that we've attached. They're packed with great insights that you can take back to your team after the webinar. So be sure to check out those afterwards. All right, so before we dive in, I just want to set the stage, and that really starts with a question that's on every CISO's mind, and honestly, every security practitioner's mind, and that is, what am I missing? And the answer is, you're always going to be missing something. It's not because you're dropping the ball, though. It's because the alerts never stop, and the threat landscape is constantly shifting. Even with dashboards for everything, you've got endpoint protection, detection, response, SIEM, ASPM, DSPM, all the acronyms. But maintaining visibility is somehow getting even harder. It's getting more difficult. And some risks are buried even deeper in unexpected places. And that really brings us to this hidden layer that we're going to talk about today, which is cryptography. It's one of the biggest risks that's hiding in the oldest layer of your security stack. And it's absolutely everywhere, right? It's embedded in infrastructure, network, applications, devices. I like to call it the quiet engine that hums behind everything, every secure network and internet connection, every software update, every digital interaction. But because it just works, it's often assumed to be secure, right? Until it's not. And that's the assumption that silence equals safety, that makes it so risky. But it's not just hidden, it's also aging. And as it ages, it's becoming increasingly vulnerable. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, to dig into what lies beneath the surface and how to address that hidden risk. So with that, here's a quick look at what we're going to be talking about today. So first, we're going to explore the role that cryptography plays in organizations, more than I think people realize. Then we're going to dig into exactly what we mean by cryptographic risk and the common blind spots and vulnerabilities that often go unnoticed. Then we're going to talk about why cryptographic discovery and inventory are foundational to addressing that risk. And then finally, we'll share some practical steps that you can take away to help understand your exposure and where to begin before we open it up for some Q&A. All right, so enough intro. Let's start shedding some lights on cryptography, because it's not just a technical detail, right? It's critical infrastructure. Sorry, I had to, Chris. But of course, we know that under every environment, there are different types of assets. There's keys, certificates, algorithms, protocols, libraries, the things that are listed here. They're all quietly working behind the scenes to do exactly what I was talking about earlier: secure those connections, verify identities, and most importantly, protect data. And I think if you're on this call, you're probably familiar with at least one or two of these. Maybe if you're in network security, that might be protocols. If you're in identity, you're familiar with certificates. But if you have to ask the average IT or security practitioner, most aren't deeply versed in all of the moving parts of this cryptographic engine. So Chris, this is where I want to pull you in. Can you just talk about these different types of cryptography and kind of where they fit into this overall picture?
Yeah, and so people, yeah, I once heard it said that where there's data, there's cryptography, and I think that's a very accurate way to look at things. The reality is that that there's all sorts of cryptography everywhere, and it's not just a single thing. We shouldn't think of cryptography as a sort of single-headed beast. It's actually a multi-headed beast, right? In the sense that on any given point, you may have multiple different types of cryptography, and you may have multiple different cryptographic elements. So a good example would be, you may be using certificates that you mentioned, right, for securing your Wi-Fi, but the data that's flowing over there may be using a different set of algorithms, a different set of cryptography, and your database that is holding the information may be using symmetric cryptography on the back end. So it's really an interconnected ecosystem as well,
Mhm.
where things sort of just have to work together. And we've been kind of lucky that everything has worked together relatively well up until now. But unfortunately, I think those days are rapidly fading into the rearview mirror. One of the reasons why it's important to get a hold of this landscape now and start to actively manage it. But I think it's coming back to it is everywhere. You can't avoid it. It is in your infrastructure today, and chances are you do not have any sort of visibility. You may over one element, say certificates.
Mhm.
You've got a certificate lifecycle management product. You can see the certs. That's great, but the whole codependent ecosystem is still being left unobserved.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I know we'll talk about some of the visibility that people may have today. Like you said, I think certificates are probably the most mature when it comes to the management around them. But just this overall landscape, as you said, it's very interconnected, interdependent, and that means you need visibility of every asset, right? Not just one. Um, so now that we've talked about where it lives, how it operates, let's talk about the problems. So for most CISOs and security teams, cryptography it's a blind spot, as Chris said. It operates in the dark. It might be everywhere. It's embedded in everything, but it's rarely inventoried or actively managed. And even when teams can see it, they often they don't have the tools or the context to understand what exactly they're working with or what to do with it. And we often describe it as a black box, right, Chris? I mean, it's implemented, it's operating, but rarely do people peek inside and see what's going on the inside, right?
Absolutely, and oftentimes when there's problems with cryptography, it's because you change one element of it and not the interdependencies to it as well. So organizations will do an upgrade from product A to product B and realize that the crypto has changed in there because the standards have evolved, and all of a sudden things don't work with each other the way they used to, and things of the sort. So it's not just a pure get to know your crypto piece. Is also there's a huge impact and overlay to risk and operations, right? What are your suppliers bringing into your environment, right? Again, you go out and acquire something new. How do you
Mhm.
know if the cryptography is good on that thing and it's not exposing your organization to already known vulnerabilities and weaknesses? So it's having it as a blind spot becomes a really difficult issue. And should be of concern to most organizations out there, and most CISOs for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So let's break down that problem a little bit more because, as you said, it's not just one issue, right? This is a layered problem, and there's multiple aspects to it. And I think first off, we've touched on this already, but cryptography being embedded in virtually every square inch of your infrastructure, and it's highly interdependent. For example, as you've said, I mean, algorithms and protocols, they influence how keys and certificates behave and what they can interact with.
Yeah,
And when that ecosystem isn't properly implemented or managed, it becomes fragile. And the challenge is that I think most organizations, it's not necessarily that they don't have visibility. Sometimes they have fragments of visibility. We've used this analogy, right, of the flashlight. Every team's got their own flashlight. They're looking, whatever they're pointing at, they can see, but there's no overall picture. There's no single source of truth, right?
absolutely. And I love the flashlight analogy because it's only as good as what you're pointing it on, but you don't see left or right of that point, right? More importantly, if anybody's ever gone for a walk in the woods and at night, and you're pointing ahead to not run into a tree, you kind of miss that route that you just tripped over. And we've all kind of stumbled on uneven ground in the middle of the night because we didn't see it in front of us, and that, really does become a problem for organizations. Because to your next point, there is because all these systems are codependent, lacking a single source of truth really does become a painful to the organization. And with the go forward path, you know, it's very much about having to make some changes that we've never had to make before at a scale we've never had to make them to reflect new standards and things that are out there. So,
Mm-hmm.
to your final point too on clarity, if you ask the web server administrator who's responsible for cryptography, they will say they are, but that's just a very narrow focus of it, right? If you ask the PKI people or the identity
Right.
folks, what are they responsible for? Security, but small part of it. You ask somebody with the ERP system, what are you responsible for? It tends to be very siloed and into very small groups here and there. But back to, I think the picture really does show the story here of not having visibility of what's actually in your building or in your infrastructure. You're simply just looking at little points of light across the radar and missing the entire picture.
Yeah. I was going to say, Chris, you can tell you live in the boonies when you can relate to going through the woods with a flashlight and tripping over roots. I don't know if that's a common occurrence.
I went camping. I'm going to bring back fond childhood memories,
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's very true, right? And to your point about the responsibility, I think if you were to ask what is cryptography or what does it mean to each person, they probably answer differently, every single one, because they're dealing with different aspects of it. And I think in a lot of cases, they'd rather not even touch it if they can avoid it, because they view it as complex for good reason. It can be challenging to work with. So yeah, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges moving forward is as we, introduce new risks into the environment that we'll talk about, it becomes increasingly important that somebody owns this problem. But today, in a lot of cases, most organizations don't have a dedicated team focused on that, right? There's developers are using it, IT's deploying it, network teams are configuring it, but no one really is accountable to the overall picture.
And it's just kind of coming through the door, embedded in things and enabled, and kind of
right.
Nice thing is it works out of the box. The bad thing is it works out of the box. I mean, once something just works, you tend to not pay a lot of attention to it. So until it breaks miserably, and then suddenly the risk vector is very detrimental to your organization.
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, I mean, these have real consequences, right? These risks, they impact security posture, they impact compliance, even operations when, systems break because these things aren't configured correctly or they expire, any number of events that can happen. So we'll dig into these risks in just a minute, but that leads us to our first poll question. So Bessem, our Oz working behind the scenes of this webinar, is going to launch the poll for everyone. And we want to know, based on the conversation we've had so far, what is your level of confidence in your organization's visibility of cryptographic assets? So maybe you're very confident, you've got a full inventory and oversight. Maybe you're somewhat confident. Maybe you're playing it safe with that answer too, but you keep an inventory of some assets, but not all. Or you're not confident. Visibility is fragmented or it's incomplete. And then lastly, maybe you're just not sure, you don't know, or you don't have a clear picture, there's no clear ownership today. So go ahead and select the option that you think best reflects your organization's current state. And as we do that, Chris, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, a reminder to everybody, we do keep our polls anonymous. So go ahead and be honest. It's we're not aware of who's answering what. This is just as much for our information as anything. So.
Exactly. But if you were to take a guess, Chris, where do you think most people are going to fall here?
My guess would be somewhere between we know some things, but we don't know all things. See a fairly even split probably between those two. Most people sort of know something about their cryptographic landscape. Say they know, what certs have been issued to whom or to what type of assets, but what they may not know is what their full stack, for instance, TLS implementations look like, or what their symmetric key landscape looks like, or what cipher suites are actually enabled across what assets within their organization. So I think everybody's got a little bit of a handle on it, but nobody, I think, has. I'd be surprised if anybody came out and said, yes, we know everything, absolutely, bar none. We're just here because we heard the coffee's good.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the results are coming in. We could probably close out the poll now. It's interesting. It aligns pretty closely with what you're saying. So absolutely nobody is very confident. So thank you for your honesty there. But we have, from what I can see, 50% say that they're somewhat confident, 33% say they're not, and 16% say that they're unsure. So yeah, I mean, pretty much where we think people would fall. And I mean, that's exactly why we're here today, right? Is to figure out, how do we address this? How do we prioritize it? And how do we tell that story also from a business perspective to be able to build a budget and a business case around, actually being able to address this challenge. All right, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We've talked about cryptography, the role that it plays. Now we want to talk about cryptographic risk. And some risks are easier to spot and often surface visible problems, right? Things that break or take down systems are an example when they're not working properly, like expired certificates. Others might run deeper or more quietly. They don't exactly raise alarms or send you a Slack message when something's going wrong. They could be buried in, as Chris said, third-party tools, source code repositories. Legacy systems can be a challenge there too. It's a bit like an iceberg like we've got here, whether it's above or below the surface, it poses a danger, but what's visible is often just a fraction of the actual risk. So Chris, I know there's lots of things, horror stories that we could probably talk about here, but can you just dig a little deeper on this? Like, what are some examples of risks that you're starting to see out there, that you've seen out there? You've been working in this space for quite some time, so I'm sure you've come across quite a bit.
I don't think people understand the size of this iceberg, to be very honest with you, first and foremost. But there is a lot of obsolete stuff that's still running. If you go across the average organization, you'll still find things like MD5 and DES in the organization. It's not uncommon, even though those have been phased out years ago. And those are presenting risk because they're known, crackable vulnerabilities. In a lot of cases, it's just misconfiguration that still has those turned on or enabled. And people just, again, something came in through the door, we turned it on, it worked. We never realized this other stuff was on, or it was capable of being used as well. But like with all icebergs, right? This shifts over time, right? And different things pop up and different things come into play. So when we look at things like quantum vulnerable algorithms, while they're of concern today, they're not. RSA is not yet deprecated. There's a timeline to it around 2030. But when that part of the iceberg falls off and needs to be grows its own little iceberg, if you want. With it is going to come things like obsolete cipher suites are going to have to be a big part of that. All of these things, like I said before, and it's really important for people to realize it's a code-dependent ecosystem. So for instance, when you go to post-quantum cryptography as an example, you've got to update all of your TLS suites, and post-quantum doesn't work over TLS 1.2. It's going to require 1.3 as an example. So, one of the interesting things that we are finding is a lot of hard-coded keys out there. A lot of things that developers have just said, "Oh, I'll build my own cryptographic algorithm into this," which again presents risk and vulnerability. But how would you know that, right? Unless you have the ability to detect and see it. The iceberg analogy is a very interesting one, but it also shifts and changes over time as new standards come in, and the ability to miss the iceberg as a whole is the important thing by having visibility into all of the things, not just one thing or the other thing. Right. For the folks on the Titanic, wish they'd had a slightly better iceberg detection system, and it wasn't above water what got them; it was underwater what got them. And I think that's a really important thing for people to recognize: is it's not just what you can see; it's what you today don't see, and how it interoperates and brings vulnerability into your organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just in case you haven't noticed, Chris and I are a big fan of analogies. They are a great way to bring things to life. And my goal with this slide deck, by the way, was to bring every analogy that we've used to life. So maybe there's another one coming, but we've done flashlights, we've done a light bulb, and we've done the iceberg. So we'll see what's coming next.
If you think about it, actually all work together, because the flashlight was, or a version of a marine flashlight was used to try to find the iceberg, and they only saw what they were pointing it at, and they could only see it at the last minute because they didn't have that visibility. So it is actually all interconnected, Ryan. It's time to watch the movie again, buddy.
Very intentional. Yeah. Well, there you go. Nice animation. So we want to bring this to the surface, right? We've talked about how deep the risks run. Now we want to bring that to the surface and talk about this from a business perspective, because as we know, it's not just a technical issue. Weaker, outdated cryptographic assets, they create vulnerabilities that put sensitive data at risk. You've also got exposed assets that create potential for a security breach, as Chris mentioned, when keys or secrets are leaked. I mean, we just saw a recent example of this with the Singularity supply chain attack, where malicious versions of a build system package were published to a public repository, and these versions included a post-install script, I think it was, that harvested sensitive developer assets, and that included SSH keys. A critical cryptographic asset that we haven't yet talked about, but those provide really privileged access to systems. And attacks like that, they don't just compromise code, right? They disrupt trust in your business. They impact audit readiness. They expose the organization to downstream supply chain risk. And as we look ahead to quantum safe migration, as you mentioned, the stakes are only getting higher. All of this adds up to a serious impact on those three things that we'll continue to emphasize, which is security, compliance, and operational resilience. So, Chris, anything you'd add here before we move to the next one?
No, actually, I think that sums it up really nicely. But I will add that supply chain risk piece back into it, and we're increasingly seeing compromises and injections into things like GitHub repositories and things of the sort. It is absolutely critical that you have visibility as to what's being brought into your environment through third-party use of that, or through your own internal development. So on and so forth, and the ability to catch those things very quickly, or even scan at source to make sure they don't exist in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a couple of things we mentioned. SSH keys, that is an area that's often overlooked, right? It's not necessarily just having visibility; it's knowing what should be used. And we're seeing slowly a shift toward SSH certificates, a much more secure and operationally efficient method of SSH. So I think, it's also thinking about what should be operating in your environment. Also, the use of public certs where private certs should be used, where you don't necessarily need that public trust. And there's impacts that are upcoming at that we'll talk about. So lots of things that, will surface when you get that level of visibility. But we want to also talk about, how do you turn this into a strategic conversation? Because at the end of the day, security teams, they're not just managing security. You're also responsible for translating that risk upwards and into an understanding of business impact. So the CFO and the board, they don't need a deep dive into algorithms and protocols. You'll more likely put them to sleep. They need clarity on the cost of inaction. That's what they need to hear. That's the opportunity here, is to frame this cryptographic risk in terms that actually resonate with them. Things like resilience, regulatory exposure, reputational risk. This Gartner reference that I've got here is a great example of that, right? This diagram shows an example of where CISO and CFO priorities can align, and where they share those priorities, and aligning the technical needs up to these overall priorities, I think, is critically important to be able to make that case and say, this is something that we need to address, because there's plenty of things that need to be addressed in the world of cybersecurity, but this is one that is continuing to move up the ladder. So I know, Chris, you have a lot of conversations, you interact with CISOs. Any ideas on how they're successfully aligning with the CFO and with the board on this topic? Have you seen instances of that where it's really done well?
Yeah, absolutely, I have, board priorities tend to be very focused on growth and revenue and cost reduction, and balance sheet issues. IT tends to be hyper focused on getting the latest and greatest tools in, and defending the organization. And unless you can, to what you're talking about here, right, translate back into business enablement language, it's very hard to probably get the attention that you need, right? A great example right now is boards are all talking about agentic AI. Agentic AI, we need this, we need to do this, we need to do that. Security professionals are like, well, wait a minute, we need to go and fix our exposure to quantum cryptography, or post-quantum cryptography, and that's more important to us from a security. The risk is bigger of that not being solved, and there's this sort of disconnect where the board and the security organizations are not talking the same language. Both very viable. Now, how do you bring that together, right? And a good example would be somewhere along the lines of sitting down with your CFO and saying, hey, there's an inherent risk here. It's going to impact our cyber insurance eventually. It's going to it's going to impact our compliance. We're going to have to do it now. or at least start doing it now, to know what we're going to need in out years to be able to do that type of a project. And oh, by the way, if we have that foundation, then layering over top of that good, secure agentic AI allows us to move forward. So we can meet both priorities effectively, as an example, and set the foundation for rapid deployment of good security for agentic AI. That's really sort of taking an example of those two things together, and then turning them into a singular conversation about go fast, but go prudently at the same time.
Right. Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into the next slide, which is, we've established the why. I think we understand why this matters. The next question is why now? If you've gotten to this point, then why do you need to take action to address this cryptographic risk now? And what we're seeing is this convergence of pressures or factors, if you want to call it, that make this risk impossible to ignore moving forward, right? As the use of, you've talked about AI and workloads, those continue to expand. So does the surface of cryptographic assets that are needed to secure them, particularly certificate-based identities in that case. At the same time, the most critical assets, the certificates that serve as the front door to websites and applications, is shrinking. As many of you know, the CAB Forum, the one who makes decisions around publicly trusted certificates, announced earlier this year that the maximum validity of those certs is going to be cut from 398 days to 200 next year, to 100 in 2027, and then down to just 47 days in 2029. So the management of those becomes critically important. And then we're also seeing this big push from regulators and standards that are actively driving the need for inventory and management of cryptography. You've got DORA, CRA, and NIS2, all three of those introduced in the last 3 years, or at least mandated in the last 3 years. In Europe, you've got the latest update to PCI DSS 4.0 that now specifically calls out the need for an up-to-date inventory of keys and certificates, and also active documentation of cipher suites and protocols at least every 12 months. And then, of course, the last one there is, we've been talking about it, right? The big one, quantum, that's fast approaching. All of this is accelerating the need for visibility, accountability, and, of course, action. And the biggest trend, I think, in terms of impact, as you've said, Chris, is certainly quantum. So I definitely want to dig a little bit deeper into that one. And that's one that you talk about pretty frequently. So can you just kind of set the stage? I know people are coming at this from different angles. I saw different job titles joining, whether it was network, there was some risk analysts, there's some security teams on here. So maybe just take a step back and understand what is this quantum threat before we get into it.
No, absolutely, and so the easiest way to explain it is with the advent of quantum computers and their abilities continuing to evolve very quickly. One of the things that a quantum computer is really good at doing is factoring numbers. And if we think about how all of our cryptography today, RSA, UCC, other algorithms are derived, it's around not being able to guess what the primes were that created the key sets. At the end of the day, the net result is predictions are somewhere around 2029 to 2034. In that range, there will be quantum computer capable of breaking traditional algorithms. And it's not just to make a key length bigger necessarily. It's not necessarily, some of the more the ways we've attacked insecure protocols in the past. This is basically going to require new protocols or new algorithms, new certificates to be deployed that are basically use a different math to do the same thing from a security standpoint, but in a way that's resistant to quantum computing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to put things in perspective too, Gartner has this threatscape. Some of you might be familiar with it. Post-quantum actually, for the first time, came onto that landscape, post-quantum cryptography. The threat actually is the quantum computer itself. The defense is post-quantum cryptography, but it's certainly notable that it's been included on this now as a volatile threat that's now on the landscape, and that organizations need to be thinking about. But one thing that we always emphasize here is that regardless of whether a quantum computer, or when a quantum computer, becomes capable of breaking current cryptography, whether it's today, 5 years, 10 years, doesn't really matter, because change is already underway. We talked about the fact that cryptography is absolutely everywhere, right? This is not an upgrade. This is a transformation of infrastructure. So, checking the news every day for a quantum breakthrough isn't a strategy. Unfortunately, I think many are waiting for that moment to happen as an indicator of when they should be taking action. But in the meantime, government agencies, they're pushing forward. New cryptographic standards are here. They're slowly moving into production ready. The vendors are announcing that. F5, recently introduced their support for these new post-quantum algorithms. And NIST has already announced the deprecation of RSA by 2030. So, advancements are being made regardless of what's happening on the quantum front. And this impact is becoming real. And if we think about the window for that transition, it's only getting shorter. That timeline is shrinking. And in reality, the threat is already here. Chris, you've talked about this harvest now, decrypt later attack vector where, data can be stolen today, encrypted data that can later be decrypted. And if there's one thing that attackers do well, it's hoard data and use it later for their own purposes. So I think that's an increasingly important attack vector, right?
I think it's super important too that people realize that almost every country has put out guidance to do a post-quantum migration, have established timelines that translate both to, obviously government use, but also to, commercial use, and that they're not doing that just for the fun of doing it. They're doing that because they identify the risk, they see the risk, they know what the timelines are like, and they're trying to give as much information as they can for people to prepare. And I do agree with you, Ryan, 100%. It's going to the timeline is getting very short now for the type of uplift that needs to happen, and that's a little bit concerning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing of concern, of course, is that there needs to be a dedicated budget to this, right? This doesn't happen without allocated resources and budget. But the cost of migrating is only going to grow the more that organizations delay. Instead of a phased migration, investment in the tools, the infrastructure, the people that they need to enable that transition. If they delay, that suddenly becomes forced procurement, forced provisioning, and adopting these new standards far quicker than if they were to, pace that out over time. And one of those first investments, as we'll talk about, needs to be discovery and inventory, something that your vendors will not do for you, that you need to act on as an organization. And that's the first phase of investment that needs to happen. And that takes time. And we'll talk about that a bit. But this cost of delay is really important to understand, especially from a board or CFO perspective, that this only increases as the timeline shrinks.
Yeah, I mean, if you're buying things today and you haven't asked your vendors what is your plan to support post-quantum cryptography, you may be buying, for instance, hardware that is going to be obsolete in the next 3 to 5 years. Most organizations look to get a much longer timeline and life cycle out of that. So this, if you've got to get into rapid, at least I think you could call it forced procurement. Love that term, but it is very difficult, and with the existing disruption in supply chain globally around a lot of elements and components that go into hardware, and the skill sets that are required to do this type of migration being limited to begin with, you can definitely start to see a trend towards the closer we get to 2030, the more expensive it's going to get to do this type of migration. And I think your point about risk shouldn't be understated, because the faster we have to do things, the less time we have to test. Less time we have to test, the more likely we're going to miss something or do something. And this is not a vendor problem, and I want to be very clear about that. This is not, as Ryan said, just do an upgrade. This requires your entire ecosystem and all of your cryptography end to end to migrate in a seamless fashion, or you will be into a position where you're going to have outages and operational disruption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the funding aspect. So this is an interesting question. We want to understand, the reality of it, the budget. So for this next poll, we want to get your take on what you think will actually drive that action inside your organization. So when it comes to funding, budget allocation, resource allocation for addressing cryptographic risk, what do you think is the biggest driver within your organization? Will it come from concerns about security and risk? Audit and regulatory requirements? Is it the need for operational efficiency and alignment of teams across the business? Or is it the need to prepare for these cryptographic changes ahead with the migration to post-quantum? understanding that you would probably select more than one option if you could. But the goal here is to really get a sense of what is that, that key driver for you within your organization, or that you see being, the thing that's going to make this real and move it forward for your business. We do have a couple questions too that come in, so I appreciate those, and we'll start to address some of those in the next one. But I will start this poll for the second question. Would love to get your guys' take on this. Chris, I think when we talk to organizations, sometimes it changes too, right? There might be an immediate security risk or vulnerability or a failed audit. I talked to someone at Black Hat actually this year. They said, hey, we were just audited for cryptographic inventory. We haven't done this before. Can you help us understand, how do we address this? That can be something that drives this, but then it might evolve into something, right? Well, now we need to think about quantum and our transition in that direction. So I think it's certainly an evolving thing.
Absolutely. And, I guess, in asking this question, one would probably put, if they had 100 marbles, a few marbles in each bucket. And, its question is, what is going to be the most important thing for your organization in driving this? I'm curious to look at the results here. So let me see. I'm not surprised looking at them that audit and regulatory is definitely driving. Number one, because as organizations, as it comes to compliance, you either comply or you're potentially not in business. So depending on the nature of your business. So.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, it looks like I'm going to close out the poll now. It looks like we've got a 40-60 split between security and audit being the highest there. So again, no surprise. I think that's going to be the immediate driver if a vulnerability or security risk is found, or an audit, you're up against an audit, or new regulatory requirements. Of course, that's going to drive urgent business needs. So thanks for everyone for answering that. But as we move forward, we want to talk about what is that path forward. If there's one takeaway from today, it's you can't manage what you can't see. The journey to managing cryptographic risk really starts with getting discovery and inventory. And before you start to address risk, prepare for quantum, meet these compliance requirements, as we've talked about, you need to know what's out there. And that means understanding these different assets, where they live, how they're used, and whether they're vulnerable. And all of the other components of this build on that foundation. So a cryptographic inventory should give you visibility into these assets that are deployed across your environment, right? It's not just listing them in a spreadsheet. It's about understanding how they're configured, as you said, Chris, where they're located and how they're actively being used, because those things can be different, right? How they're configured versus how they're actually being used. So can you talk a little bit about the tools, the infrastructure, when we look at all these different places that organizations can look, any thoughts on where they should start or how they should start to prioritize this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Ryan, because if you sort of let it go and just run its course, you're going to get back a ton of data. Now, it's important for organizations to understand why they're doing the cryptographic inventory. And I think you went back to sort of some key points, right? Which are, hey, this is a security risk that I want to manage. I want to know if there's a risk, and if I have a risk, I want to manage it. I'm doing this for compliance. Therefore, I'm going to probably take that sort of approach to it. So on and so forth. So. But I think what is absolutely important is a partial view of the world is not going to do your organization any good over the long term. It may answer a question in the here and now, but it's definitely not going to do everything. So I go back to the technology piece, look at everything, but it's also going back to the organization and saying have buy-in from everyone. And have a team that lines up to where you're going to be looking to these things, because everybody's going to be responsible for remediation in their own applications, so on and so forth. So, getting that alignment across the organization is really, really important to know what to do next through your organization.
Mm-hmm. One thing too that you call out, you actually emphasize that we should really cover this in the
Yeah.
webinar, right? Is what is a CBOM versus what is a cryptographic inventory? Do you want to talk about just what the key difference is there? Because I think that's important.
Yeah, no, it really is, and the only example I ever give here is a C-bomb is about as good as my grade 3 yearbook picture from school, or my grade 3 picture. I mean, it is a representation of me at that time, but it doesn't represent me now. You would have a really hard time being able to say, "Hey, that's Chris," if that was on my ID or on my license or anywhere else for that matter. A C-bomb is a snapshot in time, and it can be a very useful tool to say, this is what the vendor thinks that they have built into their product. But it's a little bit like the fox watching the hen house, and that their vendor provided as a general rule of thumb, and they don't continuously monitor and update. C-bombs are not dynamic in nature. So, while a C-bomb is an important part of your supply chain management, having visibility into it as a subset of your S-bomb, it is very different than an active cryptographic inventory that's continuously monitoring and flagging new things as they come into your organization and being aware of where those risks are. So, and if everybody wants my grade 3 school picture, I will respectfully find them one that's much cuter than somebody else's.
Gonna say,
I was gonna go with my high school flock of hairdo or flock of seagulls hairdo.
I mean, hey, if we're all honest with ourselves, our LinkedIn photos are a C-bomb. They're probably our profile pictures are long gone. Most people are posting theirs from 10 years ago, so or an AI version of themselves now. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate that because it's really important, right? The snapshot in time versus the real time comprehensive inventory. That's what's going to enable you to act and move forward, and that's critically important. And one of those is, reliance on you as an organization. The other should be reliance on your vendors providing those C-bombs. But both of these are important, but the inventory is certainly the step forward. So I want to talk about what are the requirements around cryptographic inventory. And I know we're running up on time. We're at 9:42. We've got just a few minutes left, so we'll keep this part quick. But this is really important, right? As we think about the path forward. So we're happy to carry this conversation offline. If you'd like to connect with us, you have the option to in the attachments. We've got a link to request a demo that equally functions as a contact us. So we're happy to continue that conversation. But let's talk about these 3 core requirements. And first, I think it's all about using the tech you already got, right? It's not as much about deploying new tools as it is about coordinating efforts and correlating inventory that might be in solutions you already have. Most organizations have many of these different components, and they all contain valuable data about cryptographic assets. It's about connecting the dots, and that requires people, process, technology. In some organizations, as we've said, you might have a dedicated cryptographic services team. I think that's pretty rare, but we have seen it. And in others, it's maybe more of a cross-functional working group where more coordination is really critical. But I mean, Chris, you've worked with teams that are doing this. What are some of the ways that people are approaching this from both the people and I guess the technology perspective, as you can see on the screen?
Yeah, I mean, the technology cannot be understated. And I was actually with a group in Munich last week, and this was a huge part of the conversation. Was being able to leverage what they've already got, right? Not having to deploy brand new stuff to go out and look at the world, and especially as it relates to sensors and agents and things like that, which tend to get to sort of icky conversations, if you will. In a lot of organizations, the reality is that being able to leverage what you have. A lot of that data, as you said, Ryan, is already being collected. It's just not being looked at from a cryptographic point of view. So it's really about having that visibility, hooking into the systems you already have, and making sure that you can go there, get that data back, and then really the team-wise, it becomes it's like I said, it's got to be cross-functional. You're going to have to look at vulnerabilities one at a time and decide whether it's urgent to remediate or not urgent to remediate. What the impact to the business is, what the cost of remediation is, but that's going to require buy-in, from everybody. I recently had a customer say, and I thought this was a brilliant way of looking at things, is that when they have this data, they can now get security and compliance on this into the same playbook, right? Whereas before they've been sort of separate and different ways of looking at the world. This is just one way that this customer was looking at it and saying, okay, you know what, I can actually have those 2 teams work together on a single playbook on a single plane versus them having to work sort of siloed and separate. And here, look at this, what I found here, pass that back, so on and so forth. They could collaborate much more effectively. And I think that's key to efficiency as well within the organization.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so coordination of both technologies and people, I think, is critically important. The next thing is, what are you going to find, right? Building that complete and accurate inventory. I think this slide, honestly, can be a little overwhelming, gives you a full picture, but every one of these cryptographic assets matter, and they're all interdependent components, as we emphasized earlier. So it's important to look at your inventory from multiple vantage points, bringing in those different tools and solutions that you have, because changing or swapping out something like a certificate, as an example, has downstream impacts on the systems that it interacts with. So yeah, I think this can be quite overwhelming. There's a lot on this slide, but every piece is important to understanding how to address this risk, right?
No, absolutely, and yeah, there was a question up in the chat too about how do you get to see all this stuff, right? And the answer is there's a lot of that sensing technology that's already there, already has a lot of that data. There's metadata, but there's also pattern recognition and things like that that these cryptographic inventory tools and systems overlay to detect things like proprietary encryption that's been built in somewhere and things of the sort. So it is a very encompassing view of the world, and it does come down to organizations at least then knowing what they have, which today most organizations just simply don't know. Right. Then you can go about fixing it, but let's at least get to know it first.
Right, exactly. And that brings us to the last one, right, is fixing it. So the emphasis in this session today is really on that visibility inventory. But when it comes to the next step, it's what do we actually do with that? And as you've said, when you conduct this inventory, if you're doing it right, you're going to find a lot of stuff. And not all of that stuff is critically important. But now that you've got that visibility, it's the next step is to prioritize what matters most and starting to take that action. So identifying vulnerabilities, mapping them to business risk, regulatory frameworks. We had a question about that as well. I think that's critically important. And then this is where you're going to take different approaches, right? Some things can be automated. Some, like renewing and redeploying certificates, that can be automated through solutions. Others are going to require more manual intervention. But those can be driven by, for instance, a ticketing system or workflows. But this is where cryptographic inventory becomes a strategic priority, not just a technical issue, and it moves from insight to action. So this is, of course, where we want to get to once we've built out that inventory, but it's important to just get that visibility first.
Absolutely, and different risks are going to move along different timelines for remediation as well. Which is also important to recognize. Today RSA is not considered weak, but we do know it by 2029 it will be. At least then you have an idea of what your workload looks like for the next 4 years or 3 years, I guess, coming up here, and you can plan for that accordingly. Some of the things that you will find probably need immediate remediation, like turning off the ability to do MD5 on a application or appliance somewhere. Those sorts of priorities will expose themselves, and at least for your next audit, you'll also be able to track on what your remediation looks like. So if you're doing a continuous inventory and you're monitoring the entire time, where you have to prove that you've taken action as a part of your audit results or your compliance efforts, you'll have the ability to do that, to sort of say, hey, we started on this date. This is what's been fixed, by now. And we're on track to do this, and this moving forward, and that becomes equally important as well.
Right, exactly. Awesome. All right. Well, we are just reaching the end of the webinar. So the question now is, where do you go from here, right? First, we want to point you to a couple resources. We've got the CISO Guide to Cryptographic Risk that goes into a lot more detail about the things we talked about today. It unpacks some of it in more depth. So be sure to check that out. That's in the attachments tab. And then second, definitely join us we've got a live interactive demo session that's going to be happening on October 8th. So that's going to happen on Zoom. So you can, unmute, you can ask questions, you can engage, and we're actually going to show what this looks like in action. Of course, key factor, we haven't talked about our solutions today. We really wanted to focus on the problem and the solution, but we do have products that address this and provide that layer of visibility, not only to help you find your cryptography, but to help you with that prioritization and moving toward remediation. So yeah, would love to have you there. Please join us. I believe there's a link in the attachments as well, but if there's not, we'll be sure to follow up with you with that invite. And then finally, just start the conversation internally. I mean, the sooner you start, the better prepared you're going to be for these changes that we've talked about, not just quantum on the horizon, but some of these changes in the regulatory landscape, in the certificate landscape, and just a growing surface of cryptographic assets that you need to address. So really glad that we had this conversation today, and thank you for those of you who've stuck around a little bit longer. I should have known, Chris, with us that we would have gone for an hour, but 5 minutes over, not too bad.
Just a reminder too, for October the 8th, if you're not able to join us, it'll probably be in syndication and reviewable. But if you'd like to too, there's a link in the attachments to book a demo and have a further conversation specific to your team and your team's needs. So I invite you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we've got, we'll address maybe a couple of questions before we drop. And I know we've got a couple in the chat here. Chris, I think you may have addressed these. One from Keith around what are the tools and items that they look at, to see if our application or hardware can be changed or if they can be fixed.
Yeah, I think the nature of the question is, hey, how can you figure out what's on a piece of hardware or what's in software and so on and so forth, and that's what leveraging the sensors does for us. They are pretty good at going deep. We just again, through the AgileSec key factor solution, there are ways to recognize what those things are and to represent those cryptographic elements and assess them against various different risk criteria. It is as complete a picture as you're going to get. The reality is that it's as good as the sensor's capabilities to pick up those things. If you need to go a layer deeper, then there are ways to do that within the solution as well. So you may start with, hey, what's my CrowdStrike telling me? What's my Tanium telling me? So on and so forth. And then you may choose to go, okay, something looks a little off here. Let me go a little deeper on that one. Type of asset or on that application, and then the ability to parlay those types of changes to go from wide to deep.
Yep. And then on that note, just kind of expanding there, we did have a question. I think we've addressed this, but what are the best tools and practices for implementing compliance systems related to cryptographic controls?
Again, that's a little bit of a broad question. Obviously, there's a bias on this call. Our tool is the best, so plain and simple. And I'll acknowledge the bias because that's important. But no, I mean, looking at it seriously, from a different lens, though, it's whatever you choose to do, doing nothing shouldn't be an option. So, inaction is not going to solve the problem. You're simply turning off the lights, walking out of the room, and hoping there's no monsters under the bed. The reality is, though, that the best way to approach it is to turn on the lights and realize that the room is messy, and that's okay because now you have a chance to go and fix it and clean it up. You've got to right size the solution to your organization. I think that's a really important piece of it. Make sure that you have a solution that has the breadth to look in all of those corners and find all of the things that are hidden under the bed. But you don't want to do a massive infrastructure rollout. You want to complement what's there, which is why you had mentioned, Ryan, those pieces that are absolutely critical around plugging into what you've already got. But I'd also go one step further and say, it's not a matter of if I need to do this, it's a matter of when are you going to do it, right? And so any organization that looks at the cryptographic requirements, depending on what your regulations are, I love echoing what customers tell me, right? And I was with a customer recently who gets a number of audits a year across their PKI, and their comment was, my auditors, and this is a regulated industry, my auditors have gone from not being able to spell PKI to all of a sudden wanting to know what all the intricacies of my PKI are and what our plans are to migrate to post-quantum cryptography. It's inevitable that it's coming. So setting yourselves up to be able to answer those questions now really does become important as well. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. Go back to the original question, but I do think, take a look at the solutions that are out there and decide what is right for your organization and what checks the most boxes in advance of compliance and regulatory and audits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And to your point, I mean, our solution does align those risks to regulatory frameworks and standards, so you can help identify what those are. But there's also, there are some good resources out there. There's plenty more beyond what Keyfactor has from government agencies. Chris, you've talked about that. CISA actually has a great one. They call it Automated Cryptographic Discovery and Inventory Solutions, ACDI. And they came out with a piece on that of just talking about this area and how it's a growing market and the tools are maturing. So certainly a great one to check out. Somebody, of course, asked for the PowerPoint. I was waiting for that one. So yes, we will be sure to follow up with that, of course. We'll send that out to attendees. And then one last one, I know we hear about this, Chris, a little bit, is quantum key distribution, or yes. I think that's QKD, right?
Yep.
And so how can we integrate QKD along with PQC as they secure at a different layer, considering unlike PQC, there's no standardization of quantum key distribution yet?
Yeah, there is some standardization. Very hard to see how those are all going to mesh together. I mean, quantum key distribution has its use cases and its applications, but it's still very young. And PQC doesn't really require, like post-quantum cryptography does, in its current form for asymmetric cryptography, does not really require quantum key distribution as an element. So the two haven't yet synced up in a super meaningful way, although there are some conversations happening in that space. It'd be interesting to see how we can how that evolves over time. QKD is where blockchain was 10 years ago in a lot of respects. It's sort of looking for the right problems to solve at scale, and will definitely solve problems at scale as it becomes more mature. But right now I'm not seeing a natural tie-in or a natural fit.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate your insights today and answering some tough questions. Really appreciate the audience as well for, again, sticking around with us, for asking some great questions, and look forward to seeing you all in the next webinar.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, everyone.